Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. A journey to a time often romanticized as all fury and steel. We're stepping back to the age of the Norsemen, the Vikings. Forget the horned helmets and endless pillaging Hollywood sold you. The truth, being a Viking wasn't always about raiding. In fact, most of the time, it was incredibly mundane. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. 1. Beyond the Blood Eagle, the reality check. When you picture a Viking, what comes to mind? Probably a longboat slicing through icy waves, a fierce warrior with an axe, maybe a roaring feast in a smoky hall. The sagas are full of glory and plunder, daring voyages and epic battles. And yes, those things happened. But those stories, they were the highlights, the rare, adrenaline-soaked moments in a life that was mostly very, very boring. Being a Viking wasn't a job title. It was a lifestyle, born of necessity and a brutal climate. Most people in the Viking Age were farmers, peasants, laborers. They didn't spend their days sharpening axes for distant shores. They spent them sharpening scythes for stubborn fields. They weren't always out sailing. They were often stuck indoors for months, just waiting. The Viking Age spanned from roughly the late 8th to the mid-11th century. And it wasn't just Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. It stretched across the North Atlantic to Iceland, Greenland, even North America. But everywhere they went, one truth remained. Life was hard, incredibly hard. And most of your time was spent trying not to starve, freeze, or get dysentery from questionable well water. Imagine your life for a moment without supermarkets, without central heating, without antibiotics, without a single soft blanket. Now imagine living that life in a place where winter lasts half the year, and the sun barely bothers to show its face. That's the default setting for a Viking, not heroic, just demanding. So tonight we're not going to Valhalla. We're going to the daily grind, the endless chores, the constant discomfort, the quiet, unglamorous realities of a life that was less about glorious death and more about making it to the next spring. Let's start with the place you called home, because it probably wasn't as cozy as you think. 2. The longhouse. Smoke, snorts, and shared spaces. You've just woken up in a Viking longhouse. It's early morning, maybe 4 or 5 a.m., but the light hasn't quite touched the world outside. Inside is dim, smoky, and surprisingly crowded. Your bed is probably a simple wooden platform, piled high with straw or hay, covered with rough wool blankets and animal skins. It's not soft. It's itchy. And you can definitely feel the lumps. Longhouses were the heart of Viking life. They were long rectangular buildings, often made of timber, stone, or turf, with turf roofs. Inside, it was typically one large, open room, sometimes divided by low walls or partitions. At the center, or along the sides, ran the hearth, a long, open fire pit that was the source of all heat, light, and cooking. And yes, smoke. Lots of smoke. There weren't proper chimneys as we know them. Smoke mostly drifted out through a smoke hole in the roof, or simply lingered. Your eyes would constantly sting. Your clothes, your hair, your very skin would smell perpetually of wood smoke. It was basically a giant communal smokehouse, and you were the slow-cured ham. The air wasn't just smoky. It was thick with the smells of human bodies, unwashed wool, cooking food, often boiled, sometimes roasted, and the livestock. Because many longhouses weren't just homes for people, they were also homes for animals. Cows, pigs, goats, chickens. They might live at one end of the longhouse, sharing your body heat, and definitely sharing their smells. It was warm, yes, but glamorous? Not so much. You'd be falling asleep to the gentle sounds of snoring humans, the distant snort of a pig, and the rustle of a chicken settling in for the night. Privacy? That was a foreign concept. Your entire family, sometimes multiple families, and all their domestic animals shared this one space. There were no bedrooms, no quiet corners for me time. Every conversation, every cough, every bodily function was communal. You learned to live side by side, in constant, unavoidable proximity. The floor was often just packed earth, sometimes with rushes or straw spread over it, which would get muddy, then dry, then dusty, and then muddy again. So stepping out of your straw bed was a daily gamble of what mystery substance your bare foot might encounter. But despite the discomfort, the longhouse was a marvel of survival. It trapped precious heat in a harsh climate. It offered protection from wolves, raiders, and the brutal Nordic weather. It was a shelter, a community, a stinky, smoky, crowded sanctuary. And in the depths of a long winter, that was everything. Now that you're awake, let's talk about what you're going to put in your stomach. It won't be fancy. 3. The daily gruel. A culinary journey of repetition and survival. You've managed to crawl out of your hay-strewn platform, dodged the family goat, and opened your smoky eyes. Now, breakfast. If you're imagining warm pastries and strong coffee, you're dreaming of the wrong millennium. Viking meals were about one thing: survival. And that meant quantity, not quality. Your typical breakfast might be a bowl of porridge, not the creamy sweet stuff you might have today. This was thick, gritty, often bland porridge made from barley, oats, or rye. It was boiled with water, maybe a bit of milk if you were lucky, and often had little else to flavor it. It was sustenance, not a culinary delight. Meat was not an everyday affair for the common Viking. While sagas might speak of feasting on roasted boar, that was for special occasions or the very wealthy. Most of the time, your protein came from preserved fish, dried, salted, or smoked. It was tough, chewy, and perpetually salty, but it kept you alive through the long winters. Maybe some cured pork or mutton, but again, saved for times of plenty. Vegetables were root vegetables mostly: cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, carrots. They were boiled into stews, often with grains and whatever scraps of meat or fish were available. This was the gruel of history, a thick, often bland stew that would simmer for days, with new ingredients added as old ones were consumed. It was efficient. It was nutritious. It was utterly, utterly monotonous. Bread was coarse and heavy, made from the same hardy grains as the porridge. It was dense, sometimes unleavened, and often made with sourdough to preserve it longer. You wouldn't slice it, you'd break it. And it was rarely fresh and fluffy, more like a sturdy edible brick designed to fill you up. And to drink? Not fresh spring water. That was risky, full of bacteria and parasites. So, like many medieval Europeans, Vikings drank ale, small beer brewed from barley, low in alcohol content, making it safer than water. Children drank it too. It was less about getting drunk and more about staying hydrated without getting violently ill. Milk, if you had a cow, would be consumed fresh or processed into butter and cheese, which would last longer. Food preservation was a constant challenge. Drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting were essential. Imagine the smells in your longhouse. Drying fish hanging from the rafters, fermenting cabbage in a wooden barrel. Your sense of smell would be perpetually challenged. So your daily meals were a cycle of porridge, boiled vegetables, tough fish or preserved meat, and thick ale. It wasn't about pleasure. It was about fueling your body for the endless work ahead. Every bite was a victory against starvation. And now that your stomach is full, it's time to work. And oh, there was always work for taming the land, the relentless grind of Viking farming. You've eaten your daily ration of heavy grain and salted fish. Now it's time to head out. Because for most Vikings, life revolved around the land. Farming in the Nordic climate was a constant, brutal negotiation with nature. It was often a losing battle. The growing season was short and unforgiving. Long dark winters meant months of inactivity, followed by a frantic rush when the snow melted and the sun returned. You didn't have lush, fertile plains. You had rocky, thin soil, often difficult to plow. You relied on simple tools, wooden plows, iron sickles, hoes, and your own aching muscles. Plowing was back-breaking work. If you were lucky, you had oxen or horses to pull a simple plow. If not, it was human power. You would dig, turn the soil, sow seeds by hand, and pray. Pray to the Aesir, to the Vanir, to anything that might listen, that the frost wouldn't come too early, or the rains wouldn't destroy your crop. The primary crops were barley, oats, and rye, hardy grains that could withstand the colder climate. Wheat was rare, reserved for the wealthy, or imported. Vegetables like cabbage, peas, and root vegetables were grown in small plots. Every harvest was critical. A bad harvest meant hunger. 2 bad harvests meant famine. It was a constant, gnawing anxiety. Beyond crops, there was livestock, sheep, goats, pigs, cows, and chickens. They provided meat, milk, wool, hides, and manure for the fields. But caring for them was constant work. Feeding, cleaning, milking, shearing, mending fences, leading them to pasture. And during winter, bringing them indoors, sharing your longhouse, and hoping they survived the cold as well as you did. If you were a woman, your work was endless. Not only did you help in the fields, but you were responsible for the household, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, weaving cloth, making and mending clothes, preserving food, and raising children. It was a relentless cycle of physical labor, day in and day out, from dawn until dusk. Children started helping with chores as soon as they were able. There was no school in the modern sense. Your education was practical, learning to sew, to tend, to mend, to survive. Your play was work, and your work was play. So your day wasn't spent dreaming of raiding distant lands. It was spent with dirt under your fingernails, the ache in your back, and the constant hum of insects around your face. It was a life of quiet endurance, powered by endless repetition and driven by the simple, profound need to survive one more day. And once you were done with that, it was time to put on your one outfit. 5. Viking wardrobe and the art of not washing much. You've toiled in the fields, your muscles aching, your clothes damp with sweat and dirt. Now, let's talk about those clothes, because in the Viking Age, fashion wasn't about style. It was about function and practicality, and rarely, if ever, about cleanliness. Most Viking clothing was made from wool or linen. Wool was crucial for warmth, especially in the cold Nordic climate. It was rough, itchy, and sturdy. Linen, made from flax, was lighter and used for undergarments, though its widespread use depended on climate and trade. You probably had two main layers, an inner tunic of linen and an outer tunic of wool. On top of that, a cloak, often made of a heavy wool or even fur, was essential for outdoor work and travel. And that was pretty much your wardrobe. You didn't have multiple outfits. You had one, maybe two, if you were lucky. You wore the same clothes, day in and day out, for weeks, sometimes months, without washing. Why? Because washing clothes was an enormous chore. It required hauling water, heating it over a fire, using precious firewood, scrubbing fabrics with lye, made from ashes, which was harsh on the skin and fabric, and then waiting for them to dry, often in damp, cold conditions. It was simply not practical for daily hygiene. So your clothes were stained, stiff, and carried the accumulated scents of your daily life: wood smoke, sweat, animal odors, and whatever you encountered in the field. But here's the interesting part. This lack of washing wasn't just laziness. The accumulated dirt, grease, and lanolin from the wool actually provided an extra layer of insulation and water resistance. It was like a natural, if smelly, form of medieval waterproofing. Footwear was simple: leather shoes or boots, often crudely made and prone to dampness. Sometimes you'd just wrap your feet in cloth or animal skins for warmth and protection. And forget socks. They were mostly unheard of. Your feet would be perpetually cold and damp. Underneath it all, the itching would be constant. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were universal companions. Everyone had them, from the peasant to the jarl. You'd scratch yourself with a casualness that would make modern society cringe. It was just a part of life. You didn't complain. You just itched. So your Viking wardrobe was a testament to utility and endurance. It was designed to protect you from the elements, not to impress. And in a world where cleanliness was a luxury, your body and clothes became a living, breathing testament to the quiet, persistent struggle of survival. 6. The long winter, confinement, and the creeping cold. And then, the winter. This wasn't just a season in the Norse lands. It was a test. A long, dark, relentless siege that could last for 5 or 6 months, trapping you indoors, limiting your movement and pushing your endurance to its absolute limits. Imagine endless darkness. The sun would barely rise above the horizon for weeks on end, especially in the more northerly settlements. Days were short, dim, and often filled with driving snow or icy rain. The world outside the longhouse was a frozen, silent expanse. Your longhouse, while warm compared to the outside, was still drafty. The central hearth provided the main heat, but the further you were from it, the colder it got. Smoke would fill the air, making breathing a constant effort. You would huddle close to the fire, wrapped in all your wool and animal skins, sharing body heat with your family, and your livestock. Food became a careful ration. All the meat you had dried, salted, or smoked. All the root vegetables you had stored in pits or cellars. Every meal was a reminder of the scarcity outside. Fresh food was a distant memory. You learned to make do with preserved, often bland, sustenance. Boredom was a silent enemy. No television, no books, unless you were a very rare literate individual, no internet. People told stories, recited sagas, played board games like Nefatafel, and meticulously crafted tools or textiles. These quiet, repetitive tasks were vital for passing the time and maintaining sanity. Women would spend hours spinning wool and weaving fabric. Men would carve wood or mend tools. It was a time of internal focus, of slow, quiet creation. Disease was a constant threat. Colds, coughs, and fevers spread easily in the cramped, smoky environment of the longhouse. Without proper medicine, a simple cough could quickly escalate into something deadly. Children and the elderly were particularly vulnerable. Every morning that you woke up, still breathing, with all your toes still attached, was a small victory. Sometimes, if the snow was too deep or the sea too rough, communities would be cut off for weeks or months. Isolation was a part of life. You relied entirely on your immediate family and the resources you had stored. No one was coming to rescue you. So the Viking winter was a long, cold endurance test. It was about quiet perseverance, relying on your community, and the sheer stubbornness of the human spirit. The sagas focus on the summer raids, but the real battle for survival, that happened in the long, dark, monotonous months of winter. And that was just the quiet life.
7. Trades and crafts, the unsung labor of the age. Beyond the farming, beyond the waiting out winter, Viking society hummed with a quiet industry of trades and crafts. Most people were self-sufficient to a remarkable degree, but specialists existed, turning raw materials into the necessities of life. This was the work that often went unrecorded in sagas, but was the very foundation of their existence. Imagine the work of a smith, not just forging swords, but repairing tools, creating hinges for doors, making nails, shaping everyday knives, buckles, and pots. The constant rhythmic clang of the hammer against the anvil, the intense heat of the forge even in winter, the meticulous shaping of metal hour after hour, day after day. It was hot, dusty, and repetitive work, but utterly essential. Then there was the carpenter or woodworker. Vikings lived in a wooden world. Longhouses, ships, tools, furniture, bowls, weapons, all required skilled shaping of wood. The constant scraping, planing, and carving, the smell of fresh pine or oak. This was painstaking, precise work, often done with hand tools, requiring immense patience. Weaving was primarily a woman's domain, and it was a monumental task. From shearing sheep, cleaning and carding the wool, spinning it into thread, often with a simple drop spindle, and then weaving it into fabric on a large loom, the rhythmic click-clack of the loom, the slow, steady growth of the cloth. A single garment could take weeks of continuous labor. Imagine the quiet dedication required, producing every piece of cloth your family wore. There were also leather workers for shoes, bags, and straps, potters for storage and cooking vessels, and jewelers for the more ornate brooches and amulets. Each craft required specific skills, learned through years of apprenticeship, a slow, methodical transfer of knowledge from master to student. Trade, too, had its quiet side. While we often think of raiding as a form of trade, there was also legitimate, peaceful commerce. Goods like furs, timber, iron, and amber would be exchanged for silver, textiles, or exotic goods from distant lands. But this wasn't fast-paced global shipping. It was slow, sometimes dangerous, methodical journeys by sea or land, negotiating prices and dealing with local customs. These were the silent engines of the Viking economy, the constant, repetitive, and often unglamorous work that kept communities clothed, fed, and sheltered. It was the daily hum of creation, far from the roar of battle, yet infinitely more common. 8. The unromanticized journey, traveling in the Viking Age. When you think of Viking travel, your mind probably leaps to the iconic longship, sails billowing, cutting through the waves, headed for distant shores. But most Viking travel was far less dramatic, often tedious, and usually quite uncomfortable. Local travel was done by foot, or if you were lucky, on a small, sturdy horse. Paths were often muddy, rocky, or snow-covered. Journeys were slow, prone to delays due to weather, and filled with the constant threat of wild animals or petty bandits. Imagine trekking for days through dense forests or across open, wind-swept moors, carrying your own supplies, constantly aware of your surroundings. For longer journeys, especially along the coasts or between settlements, boats were essential, but these weren't always grand longships. Often they were smaller, open boats, reliant on oar power or simple sails. The rhythmic creak of the oars, the splash of water against the hull, the constant rocking motion, a slow, repetitive soundtrack to your travel. Weather was always a factor. Sudden storms could whip up, turning a calm sea into a death trap. Fog could descend, disorienting even the most experienced navigators. You were constantly at the mercy of the elements, relying on instinct, basic navigation skills, sun, stars, and perhaps a primitive sunstone, and sheer luck. Even on larger ships, comfort was minimal. No cabins with plush beds. You slept on deck, wrapped in your cloaks, exposed to the wind and spray. Food was basic preserved rations. Hygiene was non-existent. You would arrive at your destination stiff, cold, and smelling of sea salt, sweat, and fish. The famous longships, often used for raiding and exploration, were marvels of engineering. But they were also open vessels, exposed to the elements. Imagine sailing across the North Atlantic in an open boat for weeks or months, in freezing temperatures, with no shelter, just the endless expanse of grey sky and churning waves. It was an act of profound endurance, not just a thrilling adventure. So while the sagas sing of heroic voyages, the reality of Viking travel was a slow, uncomfortable, and often dangerous grind. It was about enduring the elements, the boredom of the journey, and the constant awareness of your own vulnerability. The quiet hum of the waves was often the only sound for days on end. 9. Sickness and suffering, medieval medicine, Viking style. Despite their robust image, Vikings were just as susceptible to illness and injury as anyone else in the medieval world, and without modern medicine, even a minor ailment could turn deadly. Imagine a simple cut from a farming tool. No antibiotics, no sterile dressings. If it got infected, which was highly likely, it could quickly lead to a raging fever, pus-filled wounds, and eventually sepsis. You'd feel your body heat up, your joints ache, and your vision blur. Your family would do what they could, perhaps apply some herbal poultice, offer warm drinks, or simply sit by you, hoping for the best and preparing for the worst. Many simply faded away from what we would today call a common bacterial infection. Broken bones were agonizing. There were no x-rays, no surgical pins. A skilled bone setter might try to realign it, but often the bone would heal crooked, leaving you with a permanent limp or a deformed limb. Infections were a constant risk. If a leg broke, there was a real chance of amputation, a brutal procedure done without anesthesia, using crude tools, and often resulting in shock or further infection. Disease was widespread. Dysentery from contaminated water or food was common. Fevers, smallpox, tuberculosis, and leprosy were constant threats. The concept of germs was centuries away. Illness was often attributed to angry gods, evil spirits, or simply bad luck. Remedies were primarily herbal. Teas, poultices, and balms made from plants found in the local environment. Some were genuinely effective for minor ailments, but for serious conditions, they were often little more than comfort or superstition. Runes might be carved for protection, prayers offered to the gods, or sacrifices made to appease malevolent forces. Childbirth, as with all pre-modern societies, was incredibly dangerous for women. Complications during labor could easily lead to death for both mother and child. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high. Nearly half of all children might not survive to adulthood.
So, while Viking warriors might have faced death bravely in battle, the more common end came quietly, from disease, infection, or a simple injury that modern medicine would dismiss. It was a life lived with a constant awareness of your body's fragility and the ever-present shadow of pain. And when the end came, it was often unglamorous. 10. The quiet end. Viking burial and the long sleep. After a life of hard work, cold winters, and constant struggle, death in the Viking Age was often less a dramatic saga and more a quiet, expected conclusion. For many, the long sleep arrived as an escape from the harsh realities of life. While the sagas speak of great chiefs buried in longships or magnificent burial mounds, the reality for the common Viking was often far simpler. A burial might involve a simple grave mound, a stone setting, or cremation. The choice often depended on local custom, status, and practicalities. For those cremated, the body would be placed on a pyre, perhaps with some grave goods, and then burned. The ashes would be collected and placed in a pot or a simple grave. It was a swift, efficient way to return the body to the elements. For inhumation, burial, the body would be placed in a grave, sometimes with personal items, tools for a farmer, a spindle for a woman, perhaps a simple weapon for a warrior. These weren't extravagant displays of wealth for most, but rather practical items to accompany the deceased on their journey to the afterlife. The Viking afterlife was complex and varied, not just Valhalla for fallen warriors. There was Helheim, the realm of hell, for those who died of sickness or old age, a cold, misty place. There was also the possibility of joining ancestors in family mounds, or residing in the earth itself. The emphasis was often on the journey, the transition, rather than a final judgment. The act of burial itself would be a quiet, communal affair. Family and close community members would participate, perhaps offering a final prayer or a libation. There was a sense of solemnity, but also acceptance. Death was a part of life's relentless cycle. There was no grand funeral industry, no elaborate embalming. Bodies were often buried quickly, out of necessity. The grave would be dug, the body laid to rest, and the earth returned. Then, life would continue. So the Viking end wasn't always a thunderous arrival in Valhalla. More often, it was a peaceful, quiet departure, a return to the earth that had sustained them through so many struggles, a final, restful stillness after a life of constant motion and endless work. 11. The quiet legacy enduring beyond the myths. So, as you reflect on the Viking Age, that time of longboats and legendary warriors, remember what we've learned tonight, that for every daring raid, there were countless hours of mundane labor. For every feast, there were hundreds of plain, repetitive meals. For every grand voyage, there were endless, uncomfortable hours spent battling the elements. The true legacy of the Vikings isn't just in the sagas of heroes and battles, it's in the quiet resilience of ordinary people. The farmers who coaxed crops from stubborn soil, the families who huddled together through endless, dark winters, the craftspeople who tirelessly created the tools and clothing of their world, the travelers who endured the monotonous sway of the open sea. Their lives were filled with struggle, with discomfort, with the constant threat of hunger, cold, and disease. They didn't have the luxuries we take for granted: clean water, warm homes, accessible medicine, or even privacy. Yet, they persevered, they adapted, they found ways to survive and even thrive in some of the harshest environments. They were masters of their environment, understanding the rhythms of the seasons, the nuances of the land, and the power of community. Their ingenuity wasn't always flashy or dramatic, but it was profoundly effective. From banking fires to weaving thick wool, from preserving food to living communally, every quiet daily act was a testament to their enduring spirit. So tonight, as you find comfort in your warm bed with clean water readily available and a full pantry nearby, perhaps spare a quiet thought for the Vikings, not just the raiders and the adventurers, but the countless ordinary people who lived through it all, who farmed, who built, who endured the long winters, and who made it to the next spring, one quiet, hard-working, and sometimes unglamorous day at a time. Their lives were hard, but their legacy is a story of profound human endurance. And now you can rest.